Local media needs local support to survive and thrive. We don't put up a paywall, but we do need the support of our members on Patreon and sponsors. So if it's something you can do, join Christina and Andy at patreon.com/dailydetroit. That's patreon.com/dailydetroit. And thank you. Hello, friends, and welcome to your Daily Detroit. It is 313 Day, Monday, March 13th, 2023. I'm Jer Stays, and today we're doing our spring check-in on all things greenways, biking outdoors, with Todd Scott of the Detroit Greenways Coalition. There's some big developments and progress ahead in Metro Detroit when it comes to this stuff, and after this podcast, you'll know all the information and I think be as excited as I am to get back on my bike after a cold winter's nap in the garage. All right, let's get started. Joining me on the line, Todd Scott, the Detroit Greenways Coalition. You know, Todd, every spring I love to talk to you about everything that's happening around Metro Detroit and greenways and biking and getting out there and all the projects happening. So welcome back to Daily Detroit. I don't even know how many times you've been on, but you are a repeat offender with us.
Well, I appreciate you having me on the show.
Of course. So let's get into what's happening. There's a bunch around town. There are a few projects in the city of Detroit, right?
Quite a few. I think people are going to be pleasantly surprised with what they see opening up this year.
For sure. I mean, looking at this list, this is really another step in kind of a transformation of Detroit into a much more, I would say, green, much more enjoyable city in a lot of ways, especially if you want to get out there and be more mobile.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the projects are starting to get connected now, which is just a huge key to getting more usership. For example, you may recall when the DeQuinter Cut first went in, it dead-ended at Gratiot. It was still very popular, but how many people went out there, turned around, came back? But now, with the connection to Eastern Market, you see so many more people on it. And I think we're going to see that trend continuing as some of these other projects make connections, like the Riverwalk having a connection to the MacArthur Bridge to Belle Isle. It's going to be huge. The Southwest Detroit Greenway connecting the Riverwalk up to Corktown. It's a huge project. So I think as we see more of these projects expand and connect, we're just going to see usership continue to climb off the charts.
Well, I know I have a lot of listeners who love, the Riverwalk and love the DeQuinter Cut. I remember when that kind of extension was made for the DeQuinter Cut into Eastern Market and how much easier it was. I was a brave soul that would pop out on Gratiot. I remember those days. I'm so glad that it goes into Eastern Market now. I think that's a huge thing. What are a couple for the uninitiated? Because, we got a lot of new listeners since the last time we talked. For the uninitiated, what are some of the quality of life things that this really adds when you do projects like this?
Well, I think it helps people who want to get out of their car and use other forms of transportation, because a lot of things in Detroit aren't that far away, and you can, hop on a bike or an electric bike and zoom between these places and, get fresh air, get exercise, meet other people along the route, and, add to your quality of life.
100%. And the rise of bikes and e-bikes have been a big thing. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the show. One thing I wanted to mention, too, was this nearly $25 million in a road safety grant under the Safe Streets for All program. What's that going to do?
The city has already done a lot of legwork in terms of looking at where crashes are occurring on their road network. And throughout all cities, crashes aren't distributed evenly. There are some roads that have far more crashes than other roads. And so the idea is to do that analysis, figure out which roads are the least safe, where most of the crashes are occurring, and then invest in those roads to reduce those crashes. And so that's what Detroit has done with their high injury network. They applied for funding from the US DOT and got that funding to really work on some of the most dangerous roads that are causing a high number of crashes in the city.
So what are some of the examples of improvements? Maybe not specifically, but generally, what kind of work would this pay for?
Well, the most important thing you can do is reduce speeding, which is really a cause of most of the crashes we're seeing in Detroit. And not only the cause of the crash, but also more speed leads to more severity of injuries, especially for vulnerable road users like people walking and biking. So a lot of these road designs are going to get cars to drive closer to the speed limit by narrowing the road, maybe perhaps where possible, removing a lane of traffic, adding in bike lanes, reducing the width of the road so it's easier for pedestrians to walk across it. But generally, you're just trying to slow down speeders on some of Detroit streets.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense. As someone who's been around the city for quite a while, I remember last summer the videos that are on my phone of people speeding pretty quickly through some streets near the north end there because, you got 4 lanes of one-way traffic. It's almost like inviting to be a drag lane.
Right. Well, yeah, and a lot of those streets, I mean, they were done that way to reduce congestion on Woodward, and this was done, 100 years ago, and there was no freeway, there was no I-75 and other freeways. So, there's no longer a need for them to be these one-way 4-lane roads any longer. We can reimagine them and make them two-way, try to discourage through traffic and get cars to drive closer to the speed limit, which I believe would be about 30 miles per hour.
Yeah, through there it is 30. Some people might look at rearranging these roads or making some differences as a step back, but I feel like it's actually a step forward in right sizing what our cities look like. And, Detroit is one of them, but there are other municipalities around Metro Detroit that are looking at this depending on where they are and what their values are for how they want to handle their streets. But I think it's a step forward in making it much more of an attractive place to live because I think that's kind of the benefit of being a city or a dense area is having these kinds of amenities that then connect you with your neighbors, connect you with places to go, connect you with services, and kind of get into that idea of like that 15, 20-minute neighborhood.
I totally agree. And I think a great example of that is Livernois. It comes down to the question of, does the community get to design the street for their benefit, or do you continue to design the street just to accommodate car traffic? And, with Livernois, there was a trade-offs. We're probably going to lose some car traffic, but those people are probably just speeding, cutting through our neighborhood and not even shopping at our local businesses. They're just, traveling between the Lodge and 8 Mile. So let's narrow the road. Let's get cars to drive the speed limit, and this will help local business. And sure enough, it really has. The local businesses along Livernois are, coming back, and a lot of private investment has been put into Livernois, and I think most people in the community agree it's worked out pretty well.
Well, and it created whole new spaces, Those sidewalks are wider. They're able to be enjoyed more. The bike lane there actually is up and it's raised off of the roadway, which I personally find a lot safer. But I don't see that always. But I do like that was incorporated into that plan.
I think the other benefit of those sidewalk level bike lanes, too, is that there's less maintenance required. You're not getting road debris accumulating at the curb where the bike lanes typically are. So I think that's another benefit. Of course, the problem with those bike lanes is that they're very expensive. So it's not like you can just plop those in anywhere. You're actually, moving curbs, and it gets very expensive with all the utilities underneath the road. So, it's much easier to put up paint and posts, and you can get more for your money. But in places like Livernois, it's worth making that additional investment to do sidewalk level bike lanes.
Well, I think it's worth the investment, too, if you look at the lack of confusion for people. I'm going to be generous here and say that sometimes people are confused about bike lanes and where they should park. I see it a lot, actually, on East Jefferson. I'm going to be generous. I'm going to say that they're confused about where to park. When you see the bike lane that's inside the parking lane, the physical barrier of putting it on the sidewalk or having something there that's more than a plastic post, I think changes the dynamic of it. It makes it more permanent.
Well, I mean, I think for many years, in many areas, motorists have operated in an area where the rules haven't been enforced and you weren't required to follow the rules necessarily. So, I mean, I think there's a culture of that. And I'm not sure that I would call that confusion.
As I said, I'm being generous.
Yeah. Yeah, but there still is opportunity for people to make mistakes along Livernois, too. We get cars that are, parked on the sidewalk, blocking the bike lane. Where it transitions at 8 Mile, we have vehicles that park illegally and block the bike lane. Traditionally there hasn't been much parking enforcement along Livernois either, so people get away with it, and they're used to doing that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of changing.
Well, also all that infrastructure helps connect it to Ferndale as well, because we don't necessarily have to look at 8 Mile as some sort of major divider. It's something where you can actually patronize those businesses south of 8 Mile, or if you're south of 8 Mile as somebody who stayed over in the University District, makes it easier to go up into Ferndale. You think about Ferndale Project, or even shooting up Livernois all the way to downtown Ferndale. Although there are different cities, that doesn't mean that people always observe city borders. You know what I mean?
I know. Working in this field, we're more aware of who owns what and all that. But people just want to get places, and they don't care who owns it, who's responsible for what road. They just want to make sure that it's safe to travel and get them to where they want to go.
Yeah, it's all about the utility for people who are using it.
Right.
One thing I wanted to talk about people using it, but unfortunately it's not available to them. MDOT has kind of got a little bit of a thing for closing pedestrian bridges over the lodge, especially. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's something that kind of happened quickly, where there were some safety issues, but then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're going to delete. What is going on over there?
It actually has happened over a much longer period of time. We worked with a group that documented all the pedestrian bridges in Detroit and found that many of them were not being maintained, were not made ADA accessible, and MDOT largely ignored that report. I don't think they took any action on that, and that was at least 10 years ago. And in fact, they've been removing pedestrian bridges whenever they can and not involving the community in those decisions. I mean, one they removed that I thought was most egregious was the Pembroke pedestrian bridge over Telegraph Road over on the far northwest side of Detroit. They took the pedestrian bridge out rather than fix it, and they put in a crosswalk without a traffic signal over 8 lanes of traffic.
What?
For cars, I mean, the speed limit even I think is maybe 45 or 50, but cars go far faster than that. And we've had a Detroiter walking across the street get hit since that crosswalk was put in. It goes beyond just being insensitive to the safety of pedestrians. It goes into ethical issues. When you replace a pedestrian bridge with a crosswalk without a traffic signal over that speeding road, it's insane.
I mean, that sounds horrible. It sounds like real life Frogger with very bad consequences if you lose.
Absolutely. Well, I even tried to do the math to figure out the sight line and whether you could even see cars coming when you start entering the crosswalk. On most days, you're not going to be able to even see cars far enough along to make sure it was safe to cross or not.
Do they have any justification for this that they're sharing?
They didn't have to. No, they just saved money.
Oh.
They took down a bridge and they didn't have to maintain it. It was cheaper.
Oh, wow.
It's all basically financially driven. They don't prioritize pedestrian crossings, and they're trying to save as much money as they can and spend it on more car-related infrastructure. And so what's happened along the lodge is MDOT has not been doing a very good job maintaining their pedestrian bridges, in part because, the federal government doesn't require them to track that information. The federal government only requires them to track information on bridges that carry cars. So pedestrian bridges kind of go overlooked, not only in Detroit, but across the country. And MDOT felt they didn't have to maintain even the surface of these bridges, even though there's a policy that at the state level that says they're supposed to. When we asked them about it, they were even unaware that such a policy existed. And then the bridges get into such a state of repair that they can't just be fixed anymore. They need to be replaced. And then MDOT throws up their hands and saying they don't have enough money to do it.
Wow.
It's very frustrating. I think they overvalue the cost of replacing these bridges, and then they tell us they don't have the budget for it. But they don't look beyond their budget. They don't look at other funding opportunities that they could use to replace these bridges. For example, they somehow found, $20-some million to fix the pedestrian crossings over 696, but they couldn't find the money to replace some pedestrian bridges over the lodge. So they are going to do a study of all the pedestrian bridges in Detroit. I mean, initially their plan was to study all the bridges to see which other ones they could remove. We've asked them to study where they could be put back in. So that study's not gone to bid yet, as far as I know, but should be happening this year. And we're going to be tracking it and make sure the community gets involved in that discussion.
Yeah, because without a pedestrian bridge, you're basically cutting those neighborhoods even more in half and making it so there are no connections between those places. I biked over some of those bridges before they, were taken down. And like, you're absolutely right about the no ADA. To me, and I can't put words in their mouth, but it definitely feels like demolition through neglect to me.
Yeah.
And it's weird too when you can all of a sudden see like, hey, because those bridges you're talking about on 696, that's Oak Park, right? Like where they're kind of like those wider bridges that they, that's what they are. There's kind of like little parks up top, but they're actually giant bridges over the freeway for people to walk. It was originally designed for people to walk to synagogue, which I totally support and like all about the walkability, but it feels very unfair, to
does.
See Detroit not get its fair share.
Yeah, we definitely feel that way. And even with the Spruce pedestrian bridge, which MDOT will be removing, I mean, that one came to light when a pedestrian actually fell through the bridge while walking over it. Fortunately, sustained only minor injuries. So they want to remove the bridge, and they said, it'll be like a 4.5, 6 minute walk out of your way instead, and that's okay. I'm like, when do they ever close a road and propose a 6 minute diversion for cars? I think that shows you the level of priority that they give pedestrian safety. And then when it comes to bikes, they never even considered the alternative routes for bicyclists. They just said bicyclists can just ride on the sidewalk, which, of course, is not something that you'd want to do and shouldn't be promoting. So trying to change MDOT, it's an ongoing task full-time task that we're just heavily involved in, and we're going to stick with it.
Does it kind of reflect the, multi-decade culture of cars first always around Michigan?
Absolutely. Yep. No doubt about it.
All right.
Yep.
Well, there's more to talk about, obviously. The Joe Louis Greenway has a bunch of updates. Now, this is a project that so many people are excited about to see it move forward. I was actually driving over on the west side, I want to say near Rouge Park, and man, were they at work a little while ago. Jeez.
Yeah, there's a lot going on simultaneously, too. Multiple projects going on. I remember watching old State of the City addresses, just hoping, fingers crossed, that the mayor would mention, well, at that time it was called the Inner Circle Greenway, mentioning the trail, and it didn't get mentioned. And now it gets such prominent place in the State of the City address. It's super exciting to see. He also said that, he expects it to be mostly done by 2027. I think that's been moved up a little bit from where it was earlier on. There's just a lot of work to be done still, but it's all happening right now.
Well, and it's also touching a number of cities. Like I know it touches Dearborn and then also Hamtramck. I was over at Alleman Cafe and I saw like the signage and people working on actually taking the greenway through updating an alley through there, which would look super cool and a great way to experience Hamtramck. I mean, Hamtramck's going through a ton of change right now, but it's something where there's so many people through there that it could actually like tie into the greenway and then tie into the rest of the city.
Yeah, that's kind of a unique situation over there because the trail mostly uses Joseph Campo until it gets to downtown Hamtramck, where the street kind of narrows quite a bit, and it'd be extremely expensive to put in those sidewalk level bike lanes like it deserves. But for now, this trail is going to, try to calm the traffic on Joseph Campo for the more experienced bicyclists. But for everyone else, there's going to be the alleyway, which is going to be improved, and the businesses will, have a front to the greenway there, and the Alleman Cafe, which we love as well. I mean, that's going to be a great way to get to the cafe and pull in the back and grab a coffee, sit outdoors, and looking forward to doing that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm looking forward to the idea of even like biking to a Detroit City FC game because that's right off of Roosevelt. So you could just go through there and then, make a turn and there you are. And all of a sudden you don't have to worry about the stress of parking, right? You're just locking up your bike and you're good to go, which is pretty exciting. So kind of what are some things for this year that people can be excited about? Since we're in the spring, we're looking ahead here to 2023. What are the things this year that people can be excited about for the Greenway?
Number one, it's got to be the Southwest Greenway. So this is like the Quintercut's little brother over on the west side of downtown that's going to run from behind the post office eventually to the train station. I guess technically it does run to the train station along 15th Street, which is also getting some improvements as we speak. And it's like the DeQuinter It's below grade, separated. And I think people are going to be blown away, because they didn't know that railroad existed there. And it's going to make some incredible connections between everything that's happening with Ford, with Mexican Town, and also with the Riverwalk and the new Ralph C. Wilson Centennial Park that's also under construction.
Awesome. Now, a couple of things before we go. Detroit actually has a new scooter ordinance passed by City Council. And you note in your newsletter that spin scooters actually left Detroit and 10 different cities at the end of last year, which is 2022. You supported this ordinance. What will it do and why do you support it?
Scooters currently were being piloted through the Office of Mobility and Innovation. Scooter companies would come in and get a permit and operate. But, technically they probably could have gotten by without doing that. It could have done things on their own without any oversight. So this ordinance takes what Detroit has learned from that whole permitting process and puts it into ordinance so that they actually have more control over these operators, making sure that they're doing things on the up and up, instructing users where to ride, where to park their scooter, perhaps most importantly. And it just gives them more control. Spin was sold. They went through a change of ownership. So they just reevaluated what cities they're in. I don't think that's a reflection of what's happening in Detroit necessarily, although it could be they pulled out because there's so much competition in Detroit.
There is a lot of competition in Detroit for sure.
Yeah, compared to some other cities we've been to where, there's not that many operators. Detroit does have quite a few operators.
Yeah. Well, I've seen people, in places use it as kind of like the last mile or half mile solution. If there happens to be a scooter nearby when they get off the bus or something like that, they're just like, oh, hey, I'm going to grab it and then just, use it. And it's been something that I have seen those scooters get used quite a bit. So, I mean, if they're getting used, people seem to like them. So that makes a lot of sense. One thing that you mentioned that I wanted to get into, because, we were talking off air and I've got a neighbor who absolutely loves his e-bike. It has changed his life and how he gets to work. because it's so inexpensive. It's something that, except for the absolute worst weather, is usable all the time for his inner city commute, is e-bike incentives. Now, the state has decided to do an incentive, a pause in sales tax for a couple years for EV purchases, but not for e-bikes. Why do you want to add that to e-bikes?
First of all, I'd say this governor has proposed pausing sales tax on EVs for 2 years. Nothing's been approved yet by the legislature. But we feel that if it only does EVs, there are equity issues because 22% of Detroit households don't even have access to a vehicle. I don't know the percentage, but a large percentage of Detroiters who have cars probably aren't going to be able to afford EVs or aren't looking to buy a new car off the lot and won't be able to take advantage of a pause in sales tax. And we really think that everyone should be involved in this plan to reduce carbon emissions from the transportation sector. And one of the best ways to do it is getting more people on e-bikes. So we have proposed that EV sales tax pause also apply to e-bikes. Working through some issues now, but trying to get that included in the final budget proposal that moves forward. I mean, one of the issues we have is that many e-bikes are sold direct to consumers. And, in likelihood, they probably won't be able to benefit from this, but we will see if, those who buy bikes from bike dealerships, if they get an e-bike, they wouldn't have to pay sales tax. And, it's modest compared to what other cities are doing, like Denver. And so, long term, probably like to see something done perhaps through the Michigan Bridge program. But for now, this would be a good way to kickstart incentivizing e-bikes and getting some information on who buys them and how it affects their use of these transportation modes and how it affects the reduction in carbon emissions.
You mentioned Denver. What did they do?
Denver has a significant program incentivizing EV purchases that far exceeded expectations in terms of demand. And they had a program where, they had incentives for just everyone, and then also higher incentives for those who were on state assistance.
Okay.
And the numbers are starting to come back with how these are replacing car trips. It's substantial. This is the low-hanging fruit for reducing carbon emissions. I mean, this and getting more people to ride transit. Unfortunately, the state has just been a bit myopic and really focusing just on electrifying fleet. But as I mentioned earlier, that leaves out a large portion of Detroit and Michigan people who don't have access to a motor vehicle, can't afford them, can't afford the insurance. And we need to provide some very reasonable and less expensive options for those folks.
Well, and the fact is that EVs right now, this may change, but right now, EVs cost more than gas vehicles. There's incentives and things, but, they're a bit pricey, especially for a brand new one.
Their insurance costs are higher, too.
Yes, they are.
I even brought this up with the lieutenant governor. He said, yeah, my insurance rates went up when I got an EV. The cars are already unaffordable for so many folks in Detroit. Electrification-only strategy is not going to work.
There is poverty across Metro Detroit. I mean, we talk about Detroit, but also in other areas. I think about if you live within a couple of miles of your job, if you're able to do that, an EV can kind of plug that hole. If you're going from near Highland Park or whatever to downtown Detroit, or if you're going across the Grosse Points, or if you're going across, there's different things like that. It's possible that most days you might be able to take an EV to work. And it's really, kind of nice because you don't have the sweat. You're able to get out and do those things. And, there are local EV dealers in the city of Detroit. One of them we've had on the show, but there's other ones around Metro Detroit where you can actually buy local with them. You don't need to go, with the online ordering. You can get fitted right. You can get used to it, get some training with it,
That's correct. Well, we even have, manufacturer moving to Detroit to build e-bikes in Detroit.
Oh, yeah, that partnership with Detroit Bikes. Well, before I let you go, one of the things I love is when people go to other cities to get ideas and to learn how people have found success. And so recently you went to Seattle. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that trip?
Every few years, the Detroit Green Task Force, which is part of Detroit City Council, visits a city around the U.S. to learn about sustainability and green practices. And the first year they went to San Francisco, and that's really how they came back and helped launch recycling in Detroit. And the next time they went to Minneapolis, and during that trip they realized, wow, we really need to get more green transportation as part of the Green Task Force. And that's how, we began the Transportation and Mobility Committee of the Green Task Force. And last week we went to Seattle. And I tell you, Seattle was an amazing host. Their Office of Sustainability really set up a tremendous 3-day program for us. We learned about everything from how they haul their trash away to their electrification plans and their mobility plans, green stormwater infrastructure, solar. We learned about everything. And our group was 35 strong. thanks to our supporters like the Kresge Foundation and Amazon, Visitors Bureau, and Bridge Detroit. We had 4 city council members with us. We had a lot of department heads with us, and we also had advocates from the task force. And we saw a lot of great stuff. And I think 2 of the big takeaways from a transportation perspective is, one was that we need to look at traffic circles more as a way to calm traffic in residential areas. I think that's going to have some legs. I think even using traffic circles to get trucks off of our residential streets is another option too. The other thing too is they're using different kind of posts for their bike lanes that seem to be a lot more durable than the ones we have. So I'm seeing if we can't pilot those in Detroit. As someone who's been around the city, you've seen those posts broken and missing, and it's your issue. So we're seeing if we can't get something that's a little bit more durable, looks a bit nicer, and doesn't cost as much to maintain.
For sure. Well, Todd Scott, Detroit Greenways Coalition, DetroitGreenways.org. I tell you, if you're in any of this, if this conversation resonated with you, please go support them. They're doing some amazing work, Todd, and I appreciate all you're doing for Detroit and Metro Detroit, and getting people out there and enjoying the beautiful place that is Southeast Michigan.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Jerry. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to Your Daily Detroit. I'm Jer Stays. If you haven't already, consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. The more people who know about the show, the better. Tomorrow, Fletcher Sharp joins me along with celebrating the Michigan Soccer Central podcast's 100th episode with their host, Robert Kerr. Sure, we'll talk a bit about Detroit City's loss in the game ahead, but we'll also do a deep dive into Michigan's soccer scene. There are teams all over Metro Detroit, and the state is making moves. All right, remember that you are somebody, and until next time, I'll see you around Detroit.